I think we wanted this episode to just be a pretty quick, just recap of today's sports or what's going on in sports in general today, and also just kind of preview what we want to do next week, which is the interview with this NHL scout. I thought maybe what we could do is maybe pick one or two questions that we have banked that we're sending to him, and just talk about them amongst ourselves first, and then that way
Yeah,
we can get his opinion on those questions next week. What do you guys think?
sure. Why don't we do the regional sort of resource allocation that Connor and I spoke about, and that all of us liked as well. Um, and Landon had some pretty similar ones too, like about the NHL increasing or decreasing the amount of rounds. Like sports like basketball only have 2 rounds, but I believe football also has 7. So sort of what is the justification there? Is it simply the number of players per team? How do they talk about that stuff? So I'd be down to start with um, the idea of allocating resources. Like if you're a team, you have X number of scouts and X number of dollars and capital to sort of disperse around the world. How do you do that? Is each year different? Of course it is, but sort of how are those differences determined? How is a draft class being strong, weak, or average determined? And especially with certain teams, like I think about Florida being so excellent in their finish scouting, and you can sort of see that in their drafting as well. Um, that's obviously on purpose, but how does that get decided? And obviously the Canucks too, with the American players recently. I think we're really building a good stockpile of USA born players as well. So it's kind of interesting with the development team this year also having one of the strongest teams it's ever had. It's kind of interesting to think about how a scouting team plans and then executes on that plan based on region and how much money they're going to spend, how many resources they're going to allocate to certain regions. So, what do you guys think about that?
So, what I think I understand about NHL organizations, and this is just kind of from what I've researched and what I've heard, is that they have what's called like regional scouts. And up until recently, a lot of that density was kind of focused in North America, right? You would have a West Scout, you'd have a US Scout, you'd have an Ontario League Scout. And, that wouldn't necessarily mean like they're just looking at, Canadian Western leagues. That it would be that guy who could go north and south of the border. So um, kind of, I guess, covering a certain region, irrespective, I guess, of the equator. But obviously, as we've all seen, there are lots of gains to be made at the draft table when picking overseas. So Ryan, you mentioned Florida and picking these Finnish players. Well, if you've been
Hmm.
looking at any of these past drafts, these Finnish players that are coming out of whether it's the SM Liga, the Junior A League out in Finland, these guys are great players coming out of the draft. And Finland is no longer like this country that the pesky Finns, like when we were growing up at the World Juniors or watching at the World Championships or the Olympics, like the Finns were always like in kind of like maybe a little bit better than the Swiss, but now they're one of the best hockey nations in the world, right? So it's kind of interesting to see, I would say, now that they're kind of expanding out into, I guess, these other regions, these European regions and whatnot, just because of that fact, right? Whereas before it was very much more North American based.
Yeah, I mean they won the World Juniors this year. So if that's not a testament to what you just
Well,
said,
they've won the World Juniors, I think, the most since like 2010 out of any other
yeah,
of any other nation, right? So it's crazy. Country of like 8 million people.
absolutely, absolutely. Hopefully, Levy can pan out and turn into a great defender for us too, because he led them to a very convincing gold medal win in his draft year as well.
I
So
might have been more Patrick Line and yes, they put URV, but
potentially, potentially. Um, but yeah, no, the Finns have been phenomenal, and yeah, I guess we'll get to shine more light on it when we talk to this talk to the scout next week, which is awesome.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that like, to me, like that's such an interesting question because traditionally it would have been, more focused in North America, but it'd be cool to ask him, how the change has shifted if, you need someone who speaks the language to be scouting out there. What it's like to develop, I guess, your scouting culture out in, Europe as opposed to in North America, where you can check in with guys and update reports and just understand, I guess, that workflow a little bit better. So I think that's a really, really interesting question to just based on the fact that the game is growing so much, like globally.
Yeah, for sure. Did you guys have one more question that you sort of wanted to highlight before that you really had in mind, or?
Maybe one that's Canucks focused. I think I liked. I think that I liked Landon's question about like when you go draft when you go draft or scout a player that either you have stake in. So if you've drafted in the NCAA or the USHL and you're going to watch them, how likely is it for you to look at other players while you're watching, say, Besser play? So something that Landon was saying, like, oh, when you're going to watch a guy like Brock Besser, are you also watching a guy who was drafted in the same year as, like an Adam Gaudette who played in the USHL as well that year, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting question because, it comes down to, like you were saying, resources, right? These scouts can only go to watch so many games. They can only go and interview so many parents and coaches and agents. I guess they don't have agents in the USHL, but it's I guess more efficient, but it also introduces bias, and it's one of those things that at least in the analytics sphere, they push back a lot as well. As if you only see the players, you can only see so much of the players with your eye, right? So you need maybe some type of way to I don't know sift through, I guess, the sands in the sense that you want to be able to pick apart the guys who may be NHL players and who may not be NHL players and go see the ones that you think have that potential. But overall, I think we have drafted a lot from, or the Canucks have drafted a lot from the USHL or just Americans in general, and they're turning out to be pretty good picks. Like Rathbone seems to had a really, really good rookie season at Harvard.
Yeah, he did.
Tyler Madden, exactly. Lockwood, I believe, is going back for his fourth year at Michigan.
He's captain,
yeah,
I think.
but I think he's made it clear he wants to sign with the team. So if anyone has any concerns about the 4-year senior thing where he could walk, well, usually that works for guys who are high profile, prolific scorers. I wouldn't loop Lockwood into that group. So I think he would want to sign with Vancouver. And like you said, Ryan, Tyler Madden, like he had a fantastic rookie season. So it's one of those things where maybe going to this pool is a good idea.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned before about having ways to sort of streamline the process, because there's so much more to just scouting than just watching players. I believe Madden's at the same school that Gaudette went to as well at Northeastern. So maybe if there's a familiarity with the training staff there, the coaching staff there, maybe that sort of gives you a better idea of how that player is going to develop. So there's definitely an element of familiarity and consistency that you get when you're pulling from the same region, the same leagues, and as teams develop relationships with the coaches and the people who are involved in developing the players at the junior and college level. I definitely think that gives an extra element of certainty to at least the training and the types of games and the types of matchups that those players are going to experience. So I really like that point too.
Yeah, and I think in terms of trying to guide where you're going to, I guess, look, right? Because at the end of the day, most people will trust their eyes. I would say that everyone on this podcast would say that too. Like you would have to read or see something to believe it, right? So same thing goes for prospects. Like as much as we want to draft the most efficiently as possible, if you look at your draft model, like the paper one that I had made, I don't want to follow that to a T if it means that I'm going to make picks of players that I don't technically believe in, right? So it'd be cool to understand, at least on the NHL side, where their starting point is, and if it is Ryan, like you said, is it the familiarity with even some organizations? You know, like the London Knights. Like everyone seems to be drafting and picking good players on average coming out of that organization. So maybe that does play into it as a good starting point because they're like the Patriots of junior hockey, right? Like every
Yeah.
time they come in and they pick a good player, they develop them, they put them in their system, teach them the right way to play because they know that they have a long history of making NHL players. It definitely adds to like this pedigree notion of producing good players, and whether that bias is right or not. At least on the statistical side, there hasn't really been any research on it, but I would say that it does impact, at least on the anecdotal side.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I'm super excited to get some answers from someone who's actually in those war rooms, right? Because the most NHL drafting experience I have is GM mode in the NHL video game. So it'd be nice to get some real analysis from someone who actually knows what they're talking about for
So
sure.
you're saying that it's not as easy as picking McFarland first overall and having him be a franchise center in all of our GM
No,
modes, no?
not quite that. There's a little more to it,
Awesome.
just a little
Yeah.
bit.